Hi, you all. My name is Ayden Carpenter, and I'm an intern here at the Center for Research on Vermont. Today, I'll be sitting and interviewing Margaret Bass as part of our ongoing interview series. Right now, we're shifting the focus a lot towards people working towards sustainability and diversity here in Vermont. And Margaret has been a leader in diversity over her entire career. And I'm very, very excited to sit and chat with her just from everything she's done, particularly her work in Vermont education. Is there anything you want to say about yourself? Introduce yourself.
I want to thank you, Ayden, for that kind introduction and ask me whatever it is you want to know.
Man. I guess then let's start with just what really got you into all of your work, like with diversity and promoting like anti-racism. Like, where did that stem from?
Well, I mean, I define myself and have always defined myself primarily as a teacher, and that's what I am. And so this is not, it's a different kind of teaching, but it's not unrelated. It's not unrelated to my passion and my vocation. I think that I'm a Southerner, not by birth, but by upbringing. I lived in the Jim Crow South. I lived through the Black Power movement. I was an undergraduate during that time. And like a lot of my peers, we believed that the nation had arrived and that in some significant way, I think once my first academic job as an assistant professor of English was at Vanderbilt, and I've only worked for the past 25 or 30 years at predominantly white institutions. And what I have seen and my own experience as an undergraduate and a graduate student and a Black woman is that what we saw a lot of illusions, right? We had illusions about, what education did for people, right? And so the biggest shock for me was going to an academic institution and figuring out that the degree of racism, although it was sort of kind and benevolent, was every bit as bad as it was in the Jim Crow South. Remarkably different, right?
Yeah.
But race, it feels the same. It feels the same, and so I started on behalf, primarily on behalf of the students of color who were at predominantly white institutions and suffering abuse at predominantly white institutions. That's how I started DEI, working to make their lives better, and then working at institutions to recruit and, more importantly, retain faculty and staff of color.
Okay. So would you say your work really started at Vanderbilt or?
This kind of work in education, yes. It started, I was the first African American hired in the English department at Vanderbilt.
Okay.
And that was an experience in and of itself. But I think what I want to say is that as I've moved from institution to institution, and I went from Vanderbilt to St. Lawrence in upstate New York to a Research One, University of Iowa, back to St. Lawrence. So I've run the gamut of experience from small liberal arts to Research One institutions. The only commonality is that they, again, were predominantly white institutions, and the experience has been much the same for Black professionals and Black students on campuses. So yeah, I would say this is how I started doing this work, because the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a kind of term that white institutions, once we were in your face about the ways in which they were continuing traditional racist practices. This was something that, that administrators thought they came up with, but it's the work that those of us who've been in academia have been doing for a really long time.
Yeah.
And the fact that I am still doing this, I went to Vanderbilt in 1991 and it is 2022. And the fact that institutions are still hiring people to do diversity, equity, and inclusion gives you some sense of what has not happened in the academic world in decades.
I guess staying strictly in like the sense of like academia and collegiate life,
Yeah.
what do you think needs to like happen and change? I guess, well, one, so when you first like entered in like the early 90s, what has changed in like the DEI field from then to now?
Not much. I think I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. I think that primarily that most institutions have done a reasonably good job of trying to recruit students of color and faculty and staff of color. And some states like New York State actually fund programs to draw students of color to predominantly white institutions. Vermont does not have those kinds of programs, for example. I would say that what has changed is that most institutions and administrations believe that they need a face for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so they've created these jobs that are almost always for BIPOC folks that are, solo positions that say, hey, you transform this institution and make it look like somebody else thinks it ought to look, but don't disrupt business as usual, right? And that's been the continuing theme. I've had the experience of one administration that was totally on board with the mission of DEI and gave me free rein to do the work that as I saw fit. And it was a very successful endeavor. But that only happened because the president and the vice president of the institution were completely on board. Toward the end of that, when the administration changed, the story changed. So the key to the success of this work is not the persons that they hire, but the administrative readiness to see institutional and structural change. And that doesn't exist.
No, it's a very, I guess then what do you see as like the change? What do you see as like going forward? What can like running the gambit of like the really tiny liberal arts schools to like the massive, like, oh, we have 20,000 undergrad.
Yeah.
Like, what can change in order to like attract new students, retain students, stop brain drain? Like, what do you see?
Institutions have to give more than lip service to the work of DEI, right? You cannot do business as usual. Their DEI has to be a commitment in every area of the institution, as opposed to being relegated to one office and one person or two persons, right? You have to change the nature of the beast. And that's what people in power are unwilling to give up power. I mean, we see that in the nation, and the academic world is a microcosm of the nation. And so the kind of change that would demand an openness to BIPOC folks, that by and large, I'd say most institutions are not willing to make those kinds of changes. Some, yes, but most, no. You have to be able to sit back, move over, and listen to people who have been in the business, who know how to do the work. And it's tough because you will have a lot of naysayers on faculty. In particular, faculty is a tough nut to crack, right? They are wedded to, who we are, and this is our identity, and this is the way we do things, and blah, blah, blah. And so an administration has to be completely supportive, but the administration also has to be willing and able to stand up to its faculty and its board of trustees to say, this is what we're going to do. This is the way forward. And this is the way it's going to happen. And I need your support, period. If that doesn't happen, it's not going to work. We have serial DEI folks at institutions.
No, I think that's very true. I think a lot of institutions, like even ones that have low turnover, when you look at like DEI and everyone in there, like constant flipping. I guess so. I think as someone who's like in DEI and has like left institutions, is it often because of like that frustration of like you see the path forward, but it's like a physical roadblock because you can't get the support?
I retired early because of that, right? I retired early because I just got tired, right? I got tired of fighting the system. And in my most recent position at St. Michael's College, I resigned because it was absolutely clear to me that while some folks' hearts were in the right place, that really there was no institutional support for the kind of change that I was demanding, right? And I mean demanding. Like, okay, if you want me to do this, A, you have to listen to what I have to say, and B, you have to be willing to take the risk because it's risky business. I mean, we're talking about, Ayden, essentially we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about integration.
Yes.
Integration of white spaces is risky business. People died to integrate white spaces. And so the idea now that because somebody says, oh, we really want to bring BIPOC people, that's nonsense. They're not willing to take the risk for their own livelihoods, their own jobs, their own perceptions by boards and faculty members. That's the thing. And so it takes an incredible amount of courage to stand up to a board, to faculty and say, this is what we're going to do, whether you like it or not. And we've hired this person or these two people who are experts in the field. And we're going to listen to what they have to say and make painful changes to make this work. I'm not going to do that.
I guess as a question, how do you think we can like support like people building up that courage and support the people that actually do have that courage and like put them in these positions where they can actually be our allies and be our supporters?
That's a great question, but I think in the system, the academic system that really in some ways impedes, more often than not, DEI officers or student life people. And so the fact of the matter is that in an academic institution, the most powerful entity is the faculty. And so if you're trying to talk, you can't talk about curriculum. You can't talk about academic programs if you don't have a faculty credential. They're just going to ignore who you are. That's the fact of the matter. And so that's one. It has, and the system of tenure and promotion means that there are many people who want to do the work. Staff members don't have protection. They can be fired, right? If you don't have the support, overwhelming support of tenured faculty at an academic institution, you're doing nothing.
Very true.
Those are the only folks whose job, and that includes administrators, those are the only folks whose jobs are protected. And you can't blame people for not wanting to put their livelihoods on the line for DEI. People, and especially in this time, folks said, I would like to help you. I would like to, this is what I believe, but I'm afraid I will lose my job.
Yes.
You can't blame anybody for that.
No.
You can't blame any. And for an untenured faculty member to say, I'm completely supportive of the work you're doing, but I don't have tenure.
Yeah.
I'm coming up for tenure next year, and I don't want anybody to hold this against me.
Yeah. I
So,
guess as a pause for our viewers, for like people who are a little bit like less experienced with academia,
yeah,
professorship works where you first go in and you don't have tenure. Tenure kind of guarantees saying the university can't just like fire you at will.
right.
You gain it through like a mix of research and experience and commitment to the university. And once you get it, it's relatively hard to get rid of you at that university.
Super hard, super
Yeah.
hard, right? And so that an assistant professor goes in, and usually at most institutions, it's 5 years
Yeah.
for tenure, right? And that's a long time to have to tiptoe in the case of many people who feel that way, to have to tiptoe and please people and make people happy. But once one crosses over, that you're absolutely right. The conditions under which tenured faculty can be, I mean, there are very, very, very few conditions under which tenured faculty can be fired. And so the problem is, or the issue is that there are not enough, there are not, in most institutions, are not enough tenured faculty who care, really, who give a damn about DEI, because
Yeah.
they are, if they were on board, the change would happen. There's
Mm.
no question in my mind about that.
Then I guess, do you think there's merit to like approaching these and like tenured faculty and like actually trying to convince them and change their worldview? Or is it worth attacking this from a more systematic perspective? Like, where do you see the change happening?
I'm not really sure I do, Aiden. I
Mm.
mean, that's what's unfortunate. I'm not really sure that I do. I think yes, I would be. I was always open to talking with faculty and who were not quite ready or not quite on board. But you always have that sort of group the group that refuses to engage in any conversation at all, and that's a significant number of folks. Like, I'm not interested in this. This is our institution. We like it the way it is. I've been here for 25 years. Why do you want to come in and change it? Everything
Mm.
is all right, and what all these BIPOC people yelling about anyway. I mean, good grief, that we are still in this position that white institutions believe, many people believe that we should be grateful for the privilege of being at these institutions, which is absolute nonsense, right? But
Yeah.
they, that this is supposed to be some gift that they have bestowed upon us by opening their doors and letting 3, 4, 5, however many BIPOC folks in the door.
Hmm.
What do you do with that? What do you
Yeah.
do with that? Yeah. What do you do
Well,
with
then I guess, do you see like the actual students maybe as a path to the future and using the power and like the students and the student body to force change at
That's
these
the only, that's it, right? That the student voice is louder than any voice on campus, right?
Mm.
That the administration wants to, other than the faculty, the administration wants to please that constituency.
Yes.
What I have found, I mean, you are on a campus. How much sort of fervor is there among your peers for diversity, equity, and inclusion? How many of your peers? I looked around at the various institutions here in Vermont when George Floyd was murdered, and
Mhm.
yes, there were some demonstrations downtown, but I don't recall any campus
Mm.
where there was an absolute uprising and saying no, right? In the ways that, for me, living through the late 60s and the 70s on the campus, taking over administration buildings, intruding in boardrooms and saying, this must happen, or we are not going to tolerate this anymore. And so I think there's that absence among the student populations, or among many student populations, that I can't quite figure out, except not really understand. What I have found here is the absolute, that the number of students who come to their racial identities in college, right?
Mm,
It's like, well, this never happened to me before. Nobody ever called me this name before, or those kinds of things that happen to first and second year students. And I'm thinking, and my generation, that, I mean, we couldn't get to elementary school.
yeah.
So that was an awareness that I had from, the beginning of time, that I think many young people in this generation don't have.
Mm,
So it's much more difficult, I think, to recognize, not only to recognize, but to acknowledge that racism exists.
mm,
Because if it hasn't happened to me, then it hasn't happened. Right?
mm,
If it hasn't happened to me, then it hasn't happened. And I think that all of us are woefully ignorant of our history,
mm.
so that we make no connection, even between 70 and 80 and 2022. And so the one thing, unfortunately, it took, that George Floyd's murder was a racial awakening for many young people in this country, that they had to say, oh, wait, right? Oh, look, what I look like means something, because look at what happened to him. So, it's in a lot of ways, it's a different world to, I operate. I'm coming from an experience that is remarkably different from you, and, sort of the generation behind me. But what I also bring is the passion from the 70s, right? And so
Mm.
many people don't get it, don't get it. But this is life for me. It's life for you. It's life for the generations that come after us. And so, as long as I'm alive, I will continue
Mm,
to beat this drum.
mm.
This
It's
is about diversity and equity. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a thing. It's about human beings. It's about human lives. It's about dignity and respect and recognition of one's humanity. So, and that for me, that is what I'm committed to, and will be for as long as I'm alive.
beautiful. It's beautiful. No, I completely agree. I think that human aspect is very important and often neglected. A lot of people are so focused on like diversity from a very like number standpoint, or a
Yes.
very like,
Right.
oh, I have a black, I have a, like da da da.
Optics. Right. Let me take this picture of this student of color to go on the website, or to
Yeah.
go, yeah, that's it. Or to say we have X number of BIPOC students, or X, yeah. So it is, in many respects, it's a numbers game that
Yeah.
has little or nothing to do with the humanity of the folks.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I often look towards the support that goes towards minorities that's heavily focused on like the very exceptional like percentage, and there's like that second of realization where it ignores like the humanity and the aspect that like
Yeah.
these are exceptional people, you shouldn't be supporting them just because they're a minority, and there's like a whole nother like swath of this minority that you're not supporting just because they aren't like
Yeah.
the 4.0 4.5, and
Yeah.
it's very disappointing to
I mean,
see.
even the sort of designation, like we have X number of students, like all we have students, they are all human beings, and the other thing is that in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the conversation that no institution wants to have in this country is about race. We can talk about GLBTQ for we can talk about international students. We can talk about women. We can talk, and I'm all of those things, right? I'm all of those things. But what I do know The conversation that we cannot have in this nation and in academic institutions is a conversation about race, because
Mm,
white folks can't talk about race.
mm,
And white folks don't talk about race with black folks in particular, because the
mhm,
history that we share is a very uncomfortable history. And they have to face some harsh realities to figure out how we got to where we are today. And so what gets in the way of that is the refusal to, sort of be honest. And white guilt is a huge barrier to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The idea of, being afraid to speak truthfully to folks of color and black folks in particular. I mean, there's all of this nonsense that dehumanizes us, right?
mm,
Why couldn't you talk to me about? I mean, why couldn't you say,
mhm.
"Hey, black woman, let me ask you a question about," right? Why couldn't you? And if I responded in a negative manner, it's like, okay, bye. There's somebody else who'll talk to me. But so these are all kinds of all of this stuff that they put forth as reasons why we can't do what it is that we need to do.
Yeah. Hmm. I guess going back to your earlier statement about this current generation that's like in college right now and kind of like because like there's this whole very whitewashed, not whitewashed, but very not whitewashed in a racial sense, but in just like a
Mm,
sterile sense of like racism isn't there.
yeah, that. Mhm.
What do you see in like the generations that are currently in like middle and high school? Because I know you do a lot of work in like some of the local school districts in Burlington. Like, so
Mhm.
what do you see from them?
Well, I think the narrative is much the same, and in Burlington, the complication, and it's a happy complications, but in Burlington and Winooski and other school districts, but particularly in Chittenden County, BIPOC is not BIPOC, right?
Mhm.
In these districts, I have to explain, black is not black is not black, right? That to
Yes.
assume that the experience of a person from that one can just come here and understand the experience and the perspective of those of us who are born and bred in this country and feel racism and understand racism in the way that we do is ludicrous. But and so in some ways that sort of collective black really prevents conversations from happening, and
Mm.
also prevents us people from acknowledging the distinctions between and among the various black populations in
Yes.
Chittenden County. That we need to sit down and have a conversation among ourselves, because white supremacy and white supremacist notions of African Americans affects many folks from the continent of Africa.
Yes.
Many of them hold the same prejudices against us as white folks do. So there needs to be communication, in all spaces in Vermont in this context about race and what it means to be a Black American in America, and what it means to be Black in America, and
Mm.
what it means to be a Black American on campuses, and what it means to be Black on campuses. Those are remarkably different conversations that
As a
most
quick,
people are unwilling to have.
yes, I agree. I guess I will go back to that as a quick pause for viewers. Margaret is speaking about the Black population in Vermont is heavily comprised of like African migrants and refugees versus a large like African American population of people who have like been here for many generations.
Mhm.
And going back to your point, the perspectives and the ideals are very, very different.
Very
Like
different. Very,
my family has not stepped foot on the continent of Africa in many generations.
yeah,
Like, and
yeah,
I think there's a very different perspective of saying, yeah, no, my grandfather like grew up in Alabama and I have
yes,
a lot of his experiences
yes,
versus
yes.
someone who has moved here. And I think, how would you suggest like having those conversations and even starting those?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I had this conversation last week with friend of mine from the continent, and we were talking about Black Lives Matter movement, and he said, "I don't even want to talk about that; it's too political." And I
Mm,
said, this is exactly what we need to be talking about, so that we can create some understanding between us. And what the 70s did for me is, and I said to him, with the onset and the beginning of African studies, and that was my generation that made that happen.
Yeah.
We demanded that. And it happened because of my African and African American studies. I said, that allowed me to see myself in you.
Mm.
I see myself in my brothers and sisters from the continent. The problem is that they don't see themselves in me. That's the disconnect. And that's where the conversation needs to begin, right? And especially once they come to this nation.
That was powerful. Yes, I think that's a very, very important.
Yeah, I mean, I identify. I don't think anybody even uses the term Pan-Africanist anymore. But I identify myself in that way. I am a Pan-Africanist. I do believe that I have connections and relationships to people, my own folks in this country, but also from the continent of Africa. And I will believe that until I close my eyes forever. Right? It's just the way it is.
Very true. Wow. Thank you. That was really, really, that was a very fruitful conversation and sparked some ideas for me about thoughts about diversity here in Vermont.
I'm so grateful to you, Ayden, for choosing me and for having this wonderful conversation. This is encouraging. This gives me hope. It gives me hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you have anything else you want to share with the viewers? Anything?
I don't think so. I think, looking, as I said, looking at you and having this conversation with you reveals what's still possible. And for me, it's a necessary boost, because it's easy to be discouraged, right? It's easy. But you are in school, and the fact that you reached out clearly indicates that you care about these matters. And the fact that you care matters to me and gives me reason to continue the work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayden.
To the viewers, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Margaret, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.